All right, am I showing you the right screen, y'all? Yep, the full slide. Okay. All right. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'm got a little bit to talk about, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So today I wanted to address some strategies for selecting measures to assess psychosocial constructs. And this is particularly kind of geared toward people who are thinking about doing some primary data collection, either for the first time or maybe in a new space or sort of, or anyway, so that's our audience today. So today I'm going to just very briefly talk about the core elements of measurement. I'll direct you to some additional resources if anything what I say today sounds new. So it's a way for you to kind of reorient and brush up on those concepts. We'll talk about the challenge, sort of what is the main issue that we need to address, particularly when we're talking about psychosocial measurement in diverse populations. I'm going to show you an example using my own work of the CESD. Then I'll tell you about some important resources that to help you out with finding existing psychosocial measures, and then I'll close with some strategies and considerations for adapting or creating new measures for specific populations or specific questions. So the first thing just at the top, like when you're trying to select a measure, right? So you have your psychosocial construct of interest, where this, Jim, could you please mute yourself just to say, I think we're getting a little feedback. Thank you. So what do we care about at the very top? So like when you're kind of trying to measure, you've got this construct, like let's say loneliness, or let's say depression. There's going to be a lot of different choices that you can have in terms of how you would measure such a thing. So the first thing in terms of your decision tree, in terms of why you would choose one type of measure or one measurement approach versus another, is the purpose. So and that's of course something that as the scientist, like, why am I assessing this construct? Is this my main exposure? Is this something I'm hoping to change over the course of an intervention, for example? If so, I need something that's going to be sensitive to change over whatever period of time I'm interested in. Am I, interested in something that's more kind of, am I interested in this as anyway, so the point is the purpose. You want to know something about the population being studied. So am I looking at a general population or a clinical based population? We know that clinics, these are very non-equivalent in lots of different ways, including, for example, in prevalence of depression or depressive symptoms. I want to know the method of assessment. So is this by mail or telephone? Is this web or in person? All of those things will shape my choice of a measure. If I'm interested or considering a measure that has copyright attached to it, do I have the money to pay for it? And then the other sort of element that we should always think about is the reliability and validity of that measure. And we'll talk about sort of what that means in this context of a psychosocial kind of measure. So just again, very brief review. So reliability simply means consistency in measurement, and consistency can be across lots of different levels of kind of comparison. So across items, so this would be referred to, for example, I'm sure you've all heard of like Cronbach's alpha, or measure of like kind of internal consistency. So items that are supposed to be addressing kind of similar ideas should be positively correlated. Items that are measuring different ideas should be either inversely correlated or not as positively correlated with each other. Across raters. So if you and I are asked to assess the same person as a function of a construct, do we get similar answers? Across time. So this is particularly important for things like traits that we don't expect to be changing over time. If it's a state, then of course we would expect to be changing over time. And then across context. And by context, I mean a very broad term. So whether this is international, US context, across language, for example, across gender, or across race or ethnicity or immigration status, things like that we're of particular interest here in Muckwar. Now, reliability is quantified. So again, I mentioned Cronbach's alpha. Another that estimate you may have heard of is the kappa coefficient. And I'm not going to go into detail into here, but the other certain thing that's really core to the idea of reliability and validity is that reliability is a prerequisite for validity. That is, if my measure is not reliable, whether it's across items, across raters, across time, or across context, then I can't even begin to really answer the question around validity in a meaningful way. And I'll show you why this is in a second. Before I do that, let me talk about validity. So validity is referring to the degree to which a measure assesses the true status, quote unquote, of the construct that it's intended to assess. So this sounds a little tautological, but it's essentially, you can imagine that there is something, depression, out there in the world, right? And we don't have a blood test for depression. There's not some scan that you can do and be like, yes, this is definitely a case of depression, but instead we have this construct depression. And so the validity of a measure of depression is the degree to which my scale, and I'll tell you about the CESD in a second, assesses the true status of that construct. It's generally not quantified, particularly when we're talking about psychosocial constructs, and I'll explain this in a second. But there are lots, and the other thing I should say is there's lots of different ways that you can think about validity. So these are sort of in order of, how much value you should attach to them. So face validity is like just the degree to which something appears to measure what you said it's going to measure. There's probably very few scales that would not have face validity that you'd be familiar with. Construct validity is the degree to which your scale captures all the elements of the concept it's intended to measure. So for example, with depression has feelings of sadness or anhedonia, but it also has all these associated symptoms like fatigue and sleeping disturbances and feelings of guilt and things like that. And so if your measure of depression didn't capture all of those elements, we would say, that doesn't necessarily have construct validity because it's missing some important elements of it. There's criterion validity, which is the degree to which your scale either agrees with hey, Margaret, either agrees with or predicts the outcomes of some other measure. And so this, we often are metricing in terms of sensitivity and specificity. So the degree to which your scale agrees with what a psychiatrist says if a person has depression or not, for example, would be an example of criterion validity, where we assume for the sake of argument that the psychiatrist's opinion of your mental status is the criterion, or positive predictive value, negative predictive value, something like that. And then we also have convergent and divergent validity. So this is the degree to which your scale is positively correlated with related constructs. And we know that depression and anxiety, for example, are positively correlated. And it's negatively, or more likely uncorrelated or weakly correlated with opposing or unrelated constructs. So for example, a scale of depression, we would expect to be strongly positively correlated with anxiety and largely uncorrelated with, for example, a measure of conduct problems, for example. Now, the issue that we have to deal with is that sensitivity and specificity, which are the ways that we would index criterion validity, are really only meaningful to a known status that is a categorical determination that a state or a trait is present or absent based on some gold standard. So for example, like if we had like again, with the example of a psychiatrist, if we were to say a psychiatrist is a gold standard, that they know or don't, they know your true status around depression. But that's not, psychiatrists aren't gold standards. And in fact, when we talk about psychiatric epidemiology, we refer to the lead standard as sort of our way of this criterion validity. And when we're talking about something like loneliness or vigilance or any of the other kind of constructs that we might, or stress, like some of these other constructs that we're particularly interested in, there's definitely no gold standard that says, oh yes, that's high stress or that's low stress. And also most of the things that we're interested in are not there or not there, right? But rather they're on a continuum or they're a dimensional construct. And so sensitivity and specificity are really, even though we are taught these very early on as a metric of validity, are not very meaningful when we're trying to understand psychosocial constructs. And this is the last thing I'm going to say at the top. This is illustrating the relationship between validity or reliability and validity, and why it's critical or necessary, frankly, to have reliability before you can even approach something about the validity of your measurement. So this target on the far right is a measure that is neither valid nor reliable. That is, no matter, sort of you're shooting arrows, and they go every which way, and there's no predictability here. The one in the middle is a measure that is reliable. So I always shoot the arrow in the same spot, but it's not on the target. So I'm consistently measuring something, but I'm always measuring it wrong in the same way. And then the one on the far left, of course, is what we're hoping for. So I'm consistently measuring something and I'm on target in terms of what the construct is that I'm trying to measure. And so you can see here why I have to get that consistency of measurement first before I can really begin to approach anything about validity. So this is the, and I will send these slides out to everybody. So these are all hyperlinked out to different things to help you out here. So there are some additional resources just for brushing up on core ideas about measurement and survey research. I've taken this Coursera survey research course myself. I found it excellent. So just encourage you to brush up on these things. If anything I kind of talked about at the top here wasn't sort of review. So let me now turn to the issue at hand and why this is relevant for Muckwar. So why does measurement matter for minority health research? And I'm going to draw heavily from this paper by Anita Stewart that I'll also have Deborah send out or post on the Canvas site afterwards, and I'll make sure that we send it out to the MUI scholars too, for those of you who are here. So the social behavioral health sort of sciences largely depends on self-report or survey measures. And so if we're going to make valid statements of differences, and by differences that could be between racial ethnic groups, or more likely given our focus within racial ethnic groups, but differ by age or by gender or education or over time or any kind of comparison, we need to have minimal bias. And there are two types of bias that we have to deal with in terms of measurement. There's non-differential measurement bias or measurement error, which is essentially random error that's similar across the two groups being compared. So if we were doing a sample of depression among African Americans, we would say that this, and we wanted to compare men and women, that error that in the measurement of depression was similar among men and women. It wasn't systematically different by gender in this case. And that's the best case scenario. That's the kind of error we want. We know there's error, but we're hoping for non-differential. Differential is a problem because that means that we're doing a lousy job measuring, more lousy job measuring this construct in one group versus another. And that means that our inferences in terms of comparisons across the groups are suspect. And we may see differences across the groups or may not see differences across the groups when that is not the true state of the world. So the Stewart paper has this really nice figure to talk about kind of measurement concerns as it relates to differences within diverse populations. And so they refer to psychometric adequacy, which is what I just sort of talked about in terms of non-differential and differential measurement error, and conceptual equivalence across the groups being compared. And again, this could be across racial ethnic groups, or it could be within a group, within a race or ethnicity, but now comparing across, for example, like US born and foreign born Latinos, for example, or that would be another example of a within group comparison that might be of interest. So what causes conceptual non-equivalence? So what the Stewart paper says is that conceptual non-equivalence, which is referring to the idea that the concept is meaningful within one group, but not meaningful within another, or that the meaning of the concept, rather, is not the same across the two groups, is going to be due to differences in perception of the meaning of items or the constructs, or because a concept is missing an important dimension in one group. So if we're talking about depression, for example, there may be some element of that construct, depression, that is salient to men, for example, that's not as salient to women, or vice versa. Again, and right, and if we don't, and that would be the idea that there is conceptual non-equivalence of what depression is as a function of the comparison I'm trying to make in my study. Psychometric non-equivalence is this non-differential, this differential measurement error. So the idea that there's response bias that is due to either differences in the way that we answer questions or the differences in the response scales or sort of maybe inadequate translations or things like that. So there's a problem with the measurement, but it's not because the construct itself is different across the groups being compared, but there's something around the way that the scale that I'm using is not operating the same across the groups, even though they share the same concept of what depression is. So there's two different, so that's the second piece, the psychometric equivalence. That's the bread and butter of kind of measurement theory. This conceptual non-equivalence is this new piece that we have to take into account here. So why is it that measures would be affected by either conceptual or psychometric non-equivalence, particularly in the populations that we're interested in? So the first is, if going to be of no surprise, that there's just limited inclusion of concepts relevant to, they use the example of quality of care, but sorry, I should edit that. Just limited inclusion of concepts that are relevant to these populations when creating quote unquote universal scales. So, so for example, like the measure of depression, and I'll show you the example with the CESD, to what degree were concepts that are relevant to the Black population included in the creation of that scale? And I'll show you data on that in a second. There may be a lack of information. So there's just like inadequate sample sizes or inadequate, sort of due diligence in terms of looking at the psychometric invariance of measures across groups. It may be that the traditional ways that we survey people may fail to reach certain groups, so there may actually be selection bias in the samples that we're trying to apply these concepts to, okay? And that selection bias is differential as a function of whatever variable I'm trying to compare on. And then of course, the sort of more, I don't want to say like run of the mill, but sort of more expected issue of just like this translation was inadequate, or it's not written at reading levels appropriate for all populations, okay? So I want to talk just one example real quick of a study that I did a couple of years ago, I guess last year, but on the CESD. And so our goal, and this was using the health and retirement study, and again, I'm happy to send out this paper. So our goal was we wanted to quantify the agreement between the CD, which is the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, which is a more well-validated measure of depression in the general population, but is not as widely used by any means as the CESD as a measure of depression syndrome. And we wanted to examine variation in that agreement by age, sex, race, and race ethnicity among older adults. So just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page, the CESD, which stands for Centers for Epidemiologic Studies, Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale, is first published, I'm sure if you've used this scale, you've cited Radloff 1977. This paper has been cited, I think, over 50,000 times. It's one of the most, it's incredible. And it's the most widely used depression scale in population surveys. So why is it so, it must be the best, right? Well, it's brief. It's a hell of a lot briefer than something like the CD or its predecessor, the diagnostic interview schedule, which can take to measure depression, for example, just to give you this diagnostic interview schedule, when I use it in the field and when the Baltimore ECA study used it in the field, it takes people on average about 25 minutes to get through that measure. And that's if you don't endorse any symptoms. If you do endorse symptoms, we're talking about something that might be closer to 35 or 40 minutes, okay? The CESD you could probably do in 5 or 6 minutes, if not shorter, because now there's even shorter versions of the CESD. The original scale was 20 items. It can be self-administered. That's not true of the diagnostic interview schedule. And they've established thresholds to indicate clinically significant depression. So it sort of checks all the boxes. I want to measure some aspect of mental health in my giant survey. I need something that's short, that can be clinically meaningful, So, so how was this? And I had to be totally open. I have had an axe to grind against this measure for a long time, and this paper represents my ground axe, because when I went back and actually read the Radloff paper and read all the other papers that were coming out at the same time, because Radloff refers to a bunch of other papers in terms of the validity and reliability, I could not believe what I was reading. And I was like, how did we miss this? And I don't actually have maybe I need to write another paper, which is like, how did the CESD become the most widely used measure of depression? But anyway, let me show you what I found in terms of that. So where does the CESD come from? So for those of you who are in the field of mental health, you will note that 1977 is a few years before the field of psychiatry undergoes the diagnostic revolution, that is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's revision in 1980, the DSM-3, which takes the DSM from a book that's about this thick to a book that's about this thick, and creates this 8 theoretical criteria that we are familiar with today. But the CESD is prior to that. Okay, so it's not, the CESD is not informed by that revolution. So the CESD, for the first paper that used it, in the Radloff paper, he's using data from the Community Mental Health Epidemiologic Program, which was a community-based sample that was collected out of at Johns Hopkins. The Hopkins site was Washington County, Maryland. If you're imagine Maryland, which is, it's kind of got a weird shape. It's the Panhandle, so it's sitting in between Pennsylvania and I think it's West Virginia. It's in between, right? It's real rural. It's real white. And there was another site, Kansas City, Missouri. The total sample size of this program was about 3,800 people, a pretty good sample size. The total number of Black participants in the community mental health program was 295, all of whom were from Kansas City, Missouri. Now this is a direct quote from Radloff, 1997. So they don't report the reliability metrics by race or ethnicity specifically, but they say test-retest correlations were moderate, 0.4 above, in all but 3 groups: Blacks, those under age 25, and the people who needed help, that is, the people who sort of had high distress. So that's just a sentence, and then we just moved on. And then the validity. So how did they measure the validity? These thresholds that we use all the time for like indicating clinically significant depressions. Well, the way they did it is they needed a true status, okay, right? Because, and remember, we don't have a gold standard, we have a lead standard. So their lead standard was people who were hospitalized for depression. In Maryland, there were 70 people in Maryland and 35 people in Connecticut. And I can only assume that they used Connecticut because that's where Yale was. There's no discussion as to why these sites were chosen. And sure enough, they found that when they gave the CESD to people who were hospitalized for depression in Maryland and Connecticut, their scores were higher on the CESD than people when they gave this scale in the general population. And therefore, they determined that this was a valid measure because we would expect that people who are hospitalized for depression to score higher on this scale than people in the general population. At no point do they report the racial composition of the true cases, nor is there any text in the Radloff paper or any of the papers that it cites kind of describing the creation of this scale, whether the validity of the CESD varied by race. And yet it's the most widely used depression scale. So this is, so anyway, that's my X. And so here's what we found in this paper. And so what you're looking at here on the X-axis is the number of symptoms in the CESD. This is an 8-item version of the CESD that's asked in the HRS. And the 8-item CD. So they use a short form version of the Composite International Diagnostic Interview. And so that's the X-axis, the number of symptoms. And do they agree on the number of symptoms? It doesn't mean they're the same symptoms. I just want to know, like, do you even like, is there any agreement there? The Y-axis here is the kappa coefficient, okay, and which is the amount of inter-rater agreement, except now the raters are the CESD and the CD. So I'm looking at the agreement between those two. And we looked at age, which is panel A, sex, which is panel B, and race, which is panel C. And, you can see here that at higher levels of symptomatology, we get better agreement in terms of the number of symptoms. So that's, good. But we have a couple of big problems. So the first is that the CESD consistently generates higher point prevalence of depression syndrome. So if you use, depending on this kind of range of cutoffs that people have recommended for the CESD to indicate clinically significant depression syndrome, in the HRS, it's either 9.9% or 19.5%, who currently meet criteria for clinically significant depressive syndrome, as opposed to 7.7% if we used the CESD. The other, so we're getting much higher prevalence estimates, up to twice as high. And then if we assume temporarily that the CESD, that the CESD is the gold standard, and we calculate sensitivity and specificity, again, even though this is not the true gold standard, we get a sensitivity of 56 to 70%, a specificity of 85 to 94%, which is indicating that CESD is producing many more false positives, which is of course consistent with the much higher point prevalence estimates across this range of thresholds. So why does this matter, right? Well, it matters because the CESD is the only measure of depression that we use in population research that consistently estimates that the prevalence of depression is higher among Blacks than whites. All the other measures that we have, whether this is the CESD or the diagnostic interview schedule, or even the patient health questionnaire, which there's a little bit less clarification there, but it's certainly not consistently higher, whereas the CESD consistently reports higher levels of depression among African Americans relative to whites in the United States. And so it may be that that's the truth, right? It may be, right? But if we go back to the history of where this metric came from, it's not as reliable. We already know it's not as reliable. And it was the reliability that they even got was tested in a single sample of African Americans living in an urban area, right? And so like Kansas City, Missouri, and it was a much smaller sample that they had to even test this thing. So the point is we should be questioning whether or not this is the truth. So the other thing I want to say is in terms of measurement in general, is that you should, measure twice, cut once, which is for those of you who do woodworking or sewing or anything like this, right? So the only reason we were even able to do this study is because the HRS happened a few years ago to start including a second measure of depression in its scale, or in its study, the CESD. It had always had the CESD. And so because it had multiple concepts, then we could actually look at this measurement problem. And so that's my takeaway message for you. If you've got something that's really important to your study, include a couple of different ways to measure it, or, especially if they're, uncorrelated in terms of some other aspect of, they shouldn't be dependent on each other. It shouldn't be, oh, you screen into this and then you get this one, but rather if they're independent, then you can do the kind of study that we did there. Any questions before I kind of move on to the next topic?
Briana, this might be a question for the end, so feel free to shove it there. But a question I have in terms of funding is that if it's true that there aren't valid measures for whatever major construct, and you highlight that, I'm just wondering, like, how do you get funding? Because they're going to say, do the measure first, like, go create your own measure. And you're going to say, but I can't without the funding. And then you're going to be stuck. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I will address that. I don't want to shove it to the end, but I will. Let's come back to that in the end when I do talk about how to move forward. Because I actually think that the person who I'm going to punt this question to Peter for our next Muckwar meeting, because I'm going to show you an example of creating a new measure that he did, actually, that then he can maybe tell to us about how he was able to fund that effort.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before I tell you about some resources here? All right. So I want to tell you about a few different ways to, so you've gotten money for your study, you're getting ready to design your instrument, and you're, pilot it. Where you've got, again, you want to measure depression. How many options do you have, right? Or you want to measure loneliness, you want to measure stress or something like that, right? So the first place I would start is ICPSR. That is, what have existing studies, or some, ICPSR is the best place to start, but you could essentially looking at resources for existing data, actual data, not just the scale, but actual data that fielded a scale looks like. This is for two reasons. The first is that if you were to select a measure that had been used, for example, in the National Health Interview Survey or the National Survey on Drug Use and Health or some other huge giant survey, this would allow you to compare your likely much smaller than that sample that you're getting ready to collect data on, allow you to compare that to this other sample and to sort of understand the representativeness of your findings. And this is a link out to another talk I gave earlier this year on pooling data sets. So if you have the same measure, you can actually pool your data with these other data using an approach that draws on ideas from multiple imputation. Okay, so you could take your sample of 300 and get it in with a sample of 20,000. That's pretty good, right? You know, in terms of like thinking about how you can actually increase the value of your sample. The second is that because ICPSR has actual data, not just a measure, here's like the 10 item perceived stress scale, but rather here's the distribution of the 10 item perceived stress scale in X, Y, or Z population, you can actually look at the observed variation of that measure within groups that you're interested in to understand, okay, is there even variation on this measure? Because that's the last thing you want, is you want to field your measure of stress, and it turns out that nobody, like there's no variation on it in your sample. And if you don't have variation, you don't have a prediction model, okay? And it may also give you a sense of, you could actually do some psychometric analyses on it already to kind of get a sense of like, well, is this thing behaving similarly in the groups that I'm interested in? And because ICPSR has so many different data sets, you could compare this across different samples. So that's the first place I would start. So now you've done that, and now it's time, or maybe whatever, you've done that. In addition, you're going to start looking at some other toolkits for where measures live. And there's several ones that I want to tell you about. So the first is Phoenix, which stands for phenotypes for exposures. And as the name implies, that is the name phenotype. This is coming out of the genetics world. Okay, so phenotype is the observed characteristic of the world. Genotype is your, whatever, genetic base pair that you have, right? So what the Phoenix is trying to do is to recommend standard data collection protocols for biomedical research. The tools here are selected by consensus expert, and I would have put an asterisk on here. I knew many of the people at VCU who were involved. So Ken Kendler's group, for example, was highly involved in this, and so they're expert consensus, but they're expert in the field of genetic epidemiology. Okay, but if that's the study that you're doing, then this would actually be if that's what you're trying to do, I would look at what they're saying at least. It's nice because it includes both measures and data collection protocols. So it's not just the measure, but how you should field it, for example. And again, it's generally focused on genetically informative studies. And let me show you an example of what it would look like. So this is an example within the Phoenix. So on the left-hand side, I'm looking at this thing I'm interested in. You can see here, they just lump everything we are interested in under anthropology, education, sociology, and social phenomenon. I'm going down to quality of life, and they have a specific thing that they're interested in, quality of life in cancer survivors long-term. It's going to give me, if I click on that, I'm going to see this thing on the right, which gives me the description. It's going to give me the actual measure, the name of the source, and the instructions for how this measure, is this a telephone administered? Is this in person? Is this self-administered, et cetera, right? So that's the kind of thing that you would be able to do in Phoenix. Another toolkit or sort of resource for measures is PROMIS, which stands for Patient Reported Outcome Measurement Information Systems. So PROMIS is intended, as the sort of name implies with the word patient, intended for clinical settings or clinically oriented research. Or for people who are, you're trying to understand something among people who are living with a specific health condition. It also includes criterion or advice for the development of new measures, which I'll talk about after I talk about these resources. Again, they're designed to sort of enhance, patient-oriented outcomes research. It's available in multiple formats. They've already got things that are already easily integrated into existing platforms, whether this is, REDCap or things like that. You can just download that thing right there, and it's already in the REDCap format, so you don't even have to type it in. And they do have, brag about translations into Spanish and a few other languages in terms of their resources here. Another resource is the Stress Measurement Network. So this is an NIH-funded group out of UCSF. What's nice about the Stress Measurement Network in terms of their sort of measure resources that they include far more detail than I would kind of want. Like, it's almost like there's a mini review of every single measure on their website that you would consider using. So, and they have psychological measures of stress. So whether this is everything from acute stress to early life stress to work or resilience. Okay, so they've got all these different measures, and each one of them has a pretty lengthy description of where this measure came from, why you might want to use it. It's written in paragraph format, so it's a little, you got to kind of spend time with it, is what I'm trying to say, versus the other ones where it's like point and click, here's your measure, blah, blah, blah. The other thing that makes this network interesting is it also includes physiologic measures of stress, and including descriptions of them, and everything from epigenetic clocks to skin conductance. It also includes some protocols for biological sample collection. So I've hyperlinked out here, for example, to a protocol collection around hair cortisol, right? So where do you cut it? How many do you cut, et cetera, right? So that's a nice thing that these other ones don't necessarily have in terms of a protocol for this type of physiologic measure of stress. And the last metric I want to tell you about, or last resource I want to tell you about, is the science of behavior change. So this is an NIH-wide initiative that is trying to understand the underlying mechanisms of behavior to promote what they're referring to as basic research. But I would say just don't, for those of us who are social behavioral scientists, just think about mechanistic research, sort of how do we get from, depression to diabetes, right? What is the mechanism, for example, in that case? And their goal is to sort of use, essentially to use core ideas from behavioral economics. And by that, I mean things like future discounting. What are some other concepts that we, I'm just blanking completely, but, ideas from, they basically sort of operationalize the field of behavioral economics in terms of, like self-regulation, like stress, impulsivity, like these kind of ideas, right? That are, and remember, behavioral economics is basically just psychology repackaged as economics, using economic terms, because they kind of basically figured out that we're not rational beings. And so they're like, what field studies irrationality? And the field is psychology. So, and the science of behavior change focuses on 3 domains: self-regulation, stress reactivity and resilience, and what they call interpersonal and social processes. They claim to use what they call an experimental approach. And by that, they mean they identify a potential mechanism. So let's say stress reactivity. They measure that mechanism, let's say using the Trier social stress test. And then they try to develop an intervention that could influence that mechanism. So let's say like a mindfulness intervention, for example. Okay, so that would be sort of their approach. That's what they're hoping this science of behavior change is going to create in terms of the field. And they organize their measures using a different type of approach, but kind of coming similar to the stress measurement one I just showed you about, which was psychological and physiological. But they organize their measures in terms of self-report, task, which would be something like the Trier social stress test, or observational, right? So you're going to like I guess you're in a room there, you're behind a one-way mirror, and you're kind of watching people do something or respond to something in a setting. So that's how they organize their tasks or their measures. Okay. So you still didn't find what you're looking for, even after you went through all of those resources? Now what, right? So this is to Jennifer's question. All right. And I'll let you pause here for this brilliant piece of Calvin and Hobbes. So this is what I think about when like Verizon calls me for a customer service thing. I'm just like, every day I use that thing. They're like, oh, okay. Anyway. So how do we, you need to develop a new measure. How? So the first is you need to understand you are stepping into a multi-step, multimodal process. And everything that I've got here and all of this green text hyperlinks out to specific resources. This is straight from Promise. So I want to give credit where credit's due. They've done a great job of sort of explaining how they, within the Promise network, develop new measures. So the first thing is you need to do a comprehensive literature search so you can understand that construct. Because remember, we said, like I said at the very beginning, if, for example, there's an element of depression that's relevant to men and not women, or vice versa, you need to know that from the very beginning, so you can measure, when you're creating your new measure of depression, you've got all elements of that construct covered. You're then going to do some qualitative data collection and analysis to generate new items. So we usually start with focus groups to get some sort of comprehensive coverage of the conceptual area. So, and they should be focused on people who are in the population that you're interested in. And you'll do some sort of thematic analyses to perform to kind of address these topics that are discussed. So what is depression? How do you know you have depression? What does it feel like, et cetera, and see how people talk about that experience. After that focus group, you would do a sort of an initial screening process to see how that shook out essentially. After that, you would do what's called a cognitive interview, which is where you review each candidate item by multiple individuals to kind of get feedback on the language and clarity of the items. And so I want to see if I can share a different screen with you and see if this will work. Let me make sure my video is, sorry, hold on one second. I want to make sure audio. Sorry, I'm just trying this general start Zoom. Right, advanced. Okay, let's see if this works. So you should be able to see a YouTube screen now, is that correct? All right, let's see if this works. So this is a cognitive interview, part of it, and this is linked out, so you'll be able to watch the whole thing, but the only part that really matters is the next 2 minutes that I'm going to show you.
Wasn't a problem. I think we lucked out.
Can you hear that?
We picked them from a list.
Yeah.
Oh, you picked your doctor from a list?
Right.
Where did you get the list?
The health plan mailed us a list of doctors in our area that we could pick
Oh,
from.
great. So they mailed you a list.
Right.
Great. We want to know your rating of your personal doctor or nurse. Use any number from 0 to 10, where 0 is the worst personal doctor and 10 is the best personal doctor possible. How would you rate your personal doctor now?
What score can I give it?
0 is the worst personal doctor possible and 10 is the best personal doctor possible.
I would give them an 8.
An 8, okay. Please give me your overall rating in another way. Would you say your regular doctor is very good, good, okay, not very good, or not good at all?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Would you say that's a good, or a very good, or
Good.
a good? Okay.
I wouldn't say he's very good.
Okay. This question is almost the same as the one before it. Which answer choices were easier for you to use? The very good to not good at all, or the 0 to 10 scale?
About the same.
The same? Okay. Please give your overall rating of your regular doctor in still another way. Is he excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor?
Good.
You'd say good. Compare the last 3 questions. That would be the 0 to 10 question, the very good to not good at all question, or the one I just asked you, the excellent to poor question. Which do you think is the best for you to use in rating your regular doctor?
Well, the last 2 seem the same.
They seemed the same? Okay.
Right? Weren't they the same question?
It's almost the same. The answer choices are slightly different.
Okay. Whichever you want to use is fine.
Okay.
I don't
They're
have
pretty
a
much
preference, yeah.
okay. These next questions are about the healthcare services you received in the last 6 months.
So that's an example of a cognitive interview trying to understand quality of care. Now we can argue whether that was a good cognitive interview or not, but the point is like that's what you are trying to do. You're trying to see, do your questions make sense to the population that you're trying to ask them to? Do these answer categories make sense, right? Are they meaningful to them? That's what you're trying to do. I have a couple more slides here and then I will stop. So, so now you're gonna do these cognitive interviews, you're gonna get your final scale. Now it's time for some quantitative data collection and psychometric analysis. So you need to get some responses to candidate items from relevant participants. This might be something through like a mechanical Turk or something like that, where you're trying to like actually now gather some data to figure out what's the reliability of your scale. You'll then, if this is relevant, do some validation studies. So, to what degree is your instrument measuring what it's intended to measure? So again, part of this is just kind of construct validity, which is baked into this process the whole way. You might be looking at correlation with related measures. If you were developing a new scale of a construct that already exists, you must include whatever you consider the standard measure of that construct in your study, so you can compare your scale, your new scale, to this existing scale. So right now I have a student who's doing her doctoral work on the perceived stress scale as it relates to stress reactivity, and another measure of chronic stress that we developed, and we have both of those. So we're looking at how are those compared to each other, that is our chronic stress scale and our perceived stress scale, and then how are those related to stress reactivity, right, which is a physiologic measure. So we have 3 different measures of stress in the stress and sugar study that we're specifically trying to, so we can, because if we had just developed this measure by ourselves, we would have nothing to anchor it to, right? You must have something that you anchor your thing to, even if that other thing is lousy. Even if you're trying to show that other thing is lousy, you got to have it. And then translation, if you were going to do some sort of translation aspect, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but there's an established protocol for translation and back translation. So here, as I promised, this example of creating a new scale. So this is Peter Lichtenberg a few years ago created this Lichtenberg financial decision screening scale. And these 3 papers that Peter wrote, which for those of you who are not, or who are MIWI, Peter is one of our leaders of MUCWAR. The first one on the left talks about the qualitative data and the cognitive interviews of developing this scale for financial decision making. You can see that he specifically they piloted it in a sample of 29 older adults seen by Adult Protective Services. So he's trying to identify people who have been scammed essentially by financial predators, and what does he need to ask, right? So he's got this specific group of people, and he's also talking about professionals, so people in the know, and they can tell him, okay, what do people tend to get scammed by? Then you can see the reliability and validity of this in the next paper. And then finally doing some item response theory, additional sort of more fancy psychometric stuff, all on this scale. So these 3 papers I would read as, if you're thinking about developing a new instrument, these 3 papers I would read as a group because they're really nice in terms of describing the process there. This is another RICMAR resource, is publicly available on the UCLA site, which you can see here. This is the link to that YouTube video that I just showed you 2 minutes of, in terms of just an example of a cognitive interview protocol, et cetera. So just kind of learning more about that. And this is my last slide. So social and behavioral health research, we lack the equivalent of a thermometer. That is, a thermometer, no matter where I am in the world, or maybe it's affected by barometric pressure. I don't know. But the point is that largely a thermometer measures core body temperature, no matter where I am, no matter who I am. We don't have that for really anything that we're interested in. And so we need to constantly be reviewing the psychometric properties of the scales that we're interested in. And this, of course, for those of you who study adolescents or children, right? Their experience of the world is very different for things like technology and other sorts of aspects than older adults. And so, those, even like those kind of cohort changes are things that we need to be reflecting on. And like a scale that was developed in 1977, normed on a largely white rural population in Maryland is probably not the best measure for measuring depression in the United States population, much less any place else. And yet it is the main measure that we use, for example. So, but we constantly need to be doing this. Issues need to be baked into our science. And to do that is a multi-step, multimodal process. And with that, I will stop. And thank you. So Jennifer, to your question about money to do this, what I would suggest is you probably need money. So for example, the stress and sugar study, we didn't get money to develop this new stress measure. I just did it along the way. I told them I was going to measure stress reactivity and that I was going to include multiple measures of stress. When I reviewed, I relied heavily on the Phoenix toolkit. The stress measurement toolkit was not yet available. And the measures I felt did not adequately capture the full range of stress experienced as a function of poverty. And our sample was sampling people at the highest tertile of neighborhood SES enrichment and the lowest tertile of neighborhood SES. So they would ask people about how stressful their job was. Well, there's lots of measures that talk about how stressful their job was. But the only measure they had of how stressful it was to be unemployed was, are you currently unemployed? And I'm like, well, that's not, like, what is stressful about being unemployed? And my father had been unemployed for 2 years when I was in high school. So I asked him and he said, that he has to go to the, to the office, and like that, it's humiliating and it's degrading to have to go to the office. And, this like just constantly trying to put out resumes and nobody. So those are the questions that we wrote about what is the stress of being unemployed. And we wrote similar ones about disability, in terms of, the idea that people think you can work, but you're trying to apply for disability. So we developed these new questions, and they just didn't exist because they just assumed that I don't even know what they assumed. They just weren't thinking about it. So I would do that, but Peter may have been able to specifically get money for his measurement, for his development. So we can ask him and sort of see how that broke out. But I think you can do it in any study. As long as you've got to kind of anchor it no matter what to something that, like I said, we have the perceived stress scale to anchor it.
If no one else has anything, I have a question about that last point with, like, it needs to be related to other stuff. I'm having a hard time. I get that it might need to be done because those are our norms. I'm not asking about that, but like, I have a hard time with what you were talking about with, like, the conceptual. Is it conceptually the same across populations? Is it psychometrically the same? If it's not, then what value is it giving me to compare? Like, if I'm doing a depression scale and then their depression scale is faulty for all these reasons, why on earth would what information does that give me that it's going to be related to that?
Because you can demonstrate it. You can demonstrate that it's faulty. If presumably your goal is to get your scale to be the new norm, right? So you need to, sorry, no, go ahead, Jennifer. I don't want to.
So sorry, but how can I demonstrate that? Because either my new depression scale will be related to the old one, in which I'll say it's fancier. I don't know how I do that statsy wise, or it won't be related because they're different, but then it could be because I wrote a bad new scale, or it could be because it's so different from this old crappy one. So I guess I just don't understand how to.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I would say, what you would do is basically say, like, for example, if you're doing these focus groups or these key informant interviews, you could show them this existing scale and they could be like, well, that doesn't, you're providing more data to your point, right? So that is, you would show, like, look, I gave, for example, the CESD to this population, and they were like, this is not how I talk about depression. This doesn't capture my experience. That informed my development here. Yes, they're positively correlated because, like, everything's, all kind of self-report stuff has got same source bias. And so we expect a certain amount of positive correlation, but it really then just becomes about, you have to do, here's what I'm trying to say. You have to do both. You both have to show that theirs is lacks, and you have to show how yours addresses those gaps. And I say this because this to me is the most powerful argument. When I think about how am I going to make the CESD not used anymore? Like, how am I going to achieve that career goal of mine to get rid of this, get rid of this scale? It's only going to happen if I can consistently show. I can't just create the Mezuk depression scale. I need to show the weaknesses of the CESD, because I need to convince somebody, because they're like, look, if I use the Mezuk depression scale, no one's ever heard of it. I'm not going to be able to show if depression, there's all this inertia with the existing literature that I must overcome in order to get this new norm established. And maybe the CESD showed up and it took hold because it was a vacuum, because there wasn't other options for it. But that vacuum doesn't exist anymore. We have many, many, many more measures of depression. And so the only thing that's keeping it around now is ignorance in terms of the actual, like, psychometric properties of the scale. Because when I showed people this, like, literally the reviewers of this paper were like, I'm sorry, is this actually true? Like they were like they went back and read that, like they're like, we just assumed that this was not the case. And I also assumed it wasn't the case until I read a paper by Bill Eaton where he showed that there had never been a validation study of the CESD of more than 100 people. And Bill Eaton's a real smart guy. And if he says that, I was like, that's probably true. And, you know, then I just sort of got on this, this axe. So that's what I would say, Jennifer. I think you've got to do both.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
It doesn't mean that you spend all your best time and your best energy on them, you know, because it probably won't take that much to show its weaknesses. Like in my case, I just quoted Radloff, and they themselves said everything I needed to say. And so rather than saying, like, I'm basically saying we should not assume the CESD is right, but rather everything that we know about the CESD is indicating that there's problems with it. And so now the question is, what kind of evidence would it take to convince me that the CESD is right? You know? And so that's like, well, I'll compare it to this other metric. What is it? Are they equivalent? If they were, then maybe I'm wrong, but they're not.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm muted, but I'm nodding and humming and woohoo.
No problem. Good. Really yeah. No, thank you. But that's a great question. I understand. Yeah. Any other questions?
Just giving my support to this. I was talking with the mentor yesterday, and he was able to look at my grant and said, you don't have any validity or reliability, you know, of any of these measures, and it's really important to show. And I'm like, in my head, I know all that, and I've done the work, but depression in particular is something that I've looked at for a long time and have had to deep dive into. Wait a minute, they really aren't doing a lot of CDI trials with Black kids. Like, where's the best evidence of that? So I'm just grateful for this, as always.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Briana.
Yeah, I have to say, Bree, this was so helpful. Like, I took notes. It was just really great to see that, like, again, a lot of how these standard measures they were not developed and designed in racial and ethnic populations. And so I hear you. I like when you said the inertia that it takes to get measures that really aren't reliable and valid in, these groups. And then still, you can show it very much, very clearly and very straightforward. And yet, the momentum to get other measures that are more appropriate to, marginalized groups are still not well received. And so, because when I think about developing a grant, I would be leery to put in a different measure besides the CSD. Now that you've shown me this, I'm like, wow, I should put in a different measure besides the CSD potentially. Well, or maybe not, or maybe both.
Yes, you do. The answer is do both, right?
Yes.
Because the way that we have to both slow that down and put energy towards something else. But I mean, thank you for that. Because I think what I get frustrated on is like, there's this assumption that we're using it, therefore it's right. And that's where there is no gold standard for any of this stuff. And so why everything needs to be constantly interrogated. And again, the idea that, and I think with depression, I think we're a little bit more willing to have this conversation. So for example, we have like the geriatric depression scale, right? Which focuses more on like vegetative and somatic symptoms rather than the kind of psychological symptoms of depression. So they're kind of willing to engage in some of that, but the idea of cultural differences or racial difference, like this is a different, I agree, because they're like, is there a Black depression scale and a white depression scale? It's like, that's what we want. Like, we may already have that with the CESD because it keeps showing higher prevalence of depression, and actually other people have done work showing that the reason that higher level thanks, James, the higher level is because of these interpersonal items, the items on the CESD that say people were unfriendly to me. Those are items that are African-Americans are much more likely to endorse than whites. Well, is that just racial discrimination? Is the CESD picking up racial discrimination and nobody thought about that when they developed it because that wasn't in their mind? So anyway, all right.
I think this is so interesting, Bree, and I think you alluded also to looking at how is it, what was the process? What are the politics involved with this being endorsed as the gold standard? And nobody, who are these people that nobody questioned, like until you and a few others come along. So it really points to what other measures have similar, and we know other measures have similar problems. So it's very, very eye-opening.
The other place that I've done some of this, and I'll stop, is in frailty. So frailty is this, sort of idea among older adults of, kind of risk of developing disability. So at the beginning, when this concept was taking hold, we had this concept called geriatric failure to thrive, which essentially was frailty. Okay, but nobody ever used it, and it's like a terrible term, right? So whatever. So then we get in the early kind of mid 90s, we had 3 different models of frailty. This what we refer to as like the functional domains model, which looked more like kind of, can you have trouble walking, etc. We had a comorbidity model, which was kind of just an adding up of all the things wrong with you, and like how, and then we had Linda Fried's model, which is this kind of Fried biological model of frailty, and this is what she kind of put out there. And other people have shown that there's very little agreement between those 3 models of frailty between themselves. But the reason I got interested in it is because there are 5 items on the Fried index of frailty. 2 of those items are from the CESD. They are everything was an effort and it was hard to get going. And if you read the Fried papers, they never address the fact that they've taken 2 items from what is a depression scale and now are calling it frailty. And I'm like, did you just reinvent depression? So we've done several papers using latent variable modeling, so a different type of approach, looking at the overlap between, or both construct and measurement overlap between depression and frailty. And, I'm not saying that she's wrong, because I'm not saying that like the measure of, I'm not saying the CESD is a good measure of depression, but we just need to talk about it. Like you can't just like call it frailty now. So anyway, so this kind of stuff, I'm fascinated by like this history of science stuff in terms of like how these different things take hold. And if you read my gerontologist paper, it's like the last paragraph is basically like, things have changed a lot since 1977, and the measurement of depression needs to change too. And I just like leave the room. So I'm just like leave you with so anyway. Okay, we're so late over time. Oh, so
one
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sorry,
Yes. Go ahead.
I really enjoyed this presentation. I was wondering, like, is there, I've never heard of this paper, and obviously you write a lot and there's a lot of science at Michigan, but like, is there some way to like, I don't know, what's the word? I don't know, press release it or something so that, it gets out there. I don't know how you feel about talking to press and all of that, but like, if there's some way to just kind of like amplify it, just like give it more visibility, because I think this is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And like we focused on older adults because we had the HRS, but like, it's hard to do this work in other studies because many of them don't have multiple measures of depression. And so, I do agree it needs to be amplified, and maybe the next paper I want to write, Ketlin, and if you want to help me out with it, let me know, is the top 10 reasons you should stop using this CESD. And I have about 8 of them fleshed out in my head, but like I want to be as upfront as possible about it. Just like no, don't like interpret what I'm trying to say, which is stop using this measure, but like no, these are the 10 reasons you need to stop using this measure. And the other thing, there's another really great paper by Ken Bolin, who's a psychometrician at UNC or maybe Duke, I can't remember, but he's done some very, very fancy psychometric stuff showing that the CESD isn't even a unidimensional construct in adolescents that aren't white. And so it's like the basic assumption of measurement theory is that I can add up all those items on the CESD because they're all measuring the same construct. Well, according to Ken Bolin, they're not this, like they're actually 2 different factors. And so you shouldn't be adding those things up to get a common score. And, just really, it's like all of the, and again, I don't know, but again, he published that paper in some kind of obscure sociology journal. So to me, like there's just growing evidence that this is not what we think it is. And I'm not saying the emperor has no clothes, but like the emperor is underdressed severely.
You know, I think to Caitlin's point, maybe there's a way we could have on the Muckwar website cutting edge ideas or something to really draw attention, because okay, this talk, all Wasim's work, all these other things that we do are on the website. We're posting them there, but you know, you kind of got to have to look for it.
Yeah.
So something about cutting edge ideas, things you should know, you know, that people could go to directly, maybe
Yeah.
something to consider.
I love that idea. I mean, anything we can do to kind of push out this, you know, and I'm trying to kind of, the audience I want to talk to are the you know, the survey researchers and things like that. And so, no, it's okay that you put it in. It's just sin no more, right? It's not, we've all sinned. I've published plenty of papers on the CESD, you know, and I think again, and part of this, like, even when I talk to my own students, they're like, how should I talk? Cause they've, you know, I'll point them to this paper and they're like, oh my God, I can't even, my dissertation's trash. I'm like, no, that's not true. That's not what I'm saying. But the CESD is a measure. Whether it is a measure of clinical depression there is very little evidence that that's true. So I think it's very fair for you to say you have assessed depressive symptoms. Have you measured depression syndrome? Have you measured clinically significant depression? Unlikely, you know? So that's the way we talk about it, is we say elevated depressive symptoms, higher scores on the CESD, right? All of those are true statements, but they keep you closer to what you actually have, which is 8 items of how have you felt over the last week or two, versus this is a clinical syndrome that is relevant to people's, you know, functional and health status and et cetera, right? In the same way that major depression is relevant to functioning and health status, right? And like that, the depression is really important. We do need to be measuring it. Like, so I don't want people to sort of think we don't. The other thing that's really hard about mental health is, like, outside of things like the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, or kind of surveys that are designed to measure mental health, we often only have one measure of mental health, and it's often only a depression measure, and that's it. And so it becomes, I think that's part of why it becomes so monolithic, because there's no alternative. You can't even look at anxiety, or you can't even look at substance problems or sleeping problems or any of these other things that we actually, like, why we think depression is problematic. So it's when we only, you know, we kind of put all our eggs in one basket, not just for one measure of depression, but of one construct of all of the thing, like that CESD is covering everything from the neck up, right? Which is kind of ridiculous. I'm glad to hear, Margaret. Like, I think, again, those are, and maybe that's what this paper should say, like, this 10 reasons why you should stop using the CESD, but then there should be a, like, oh no, you use the CESD, how should you talk about it, right? And, like, specifically give some advice on, like, this is what you have, this is not what you have, right? And so this is if we can kind of distinguish the measure from the construct, then we can begin to have a conversation of what are some other ways I could measure that construct. But right now, they're conflated completely. And that's the problem, because this measure is not a measure that is relevant or applicable, or, you know, what we think it is, particularly not in minority groups. All right, I've gone over. Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully this was helpful, and we will send out everything. Deborah, I know we have a meeting later today, but I'll send you an email with all of these readings and stuff attached so we can get it out. So thank you so much for